Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm always proud to rise in this House and represent the people of Timmins James Bay. It's particularly interesting to rise now after listening to what could be called a political screed by my friend from Winnipeg, because certainly when we talk about closing ethical loopholes, it always upsets Liberals. Because there's just something about ethical breaches and Liberals that go hand in hand. It's about their idea of friendship. You know, the Aga Khan was a close personal friend of the Prime Minister, apparently, when the Prime Minister took his trip to Billionaires Island, and yet he hadn't really seen him in 30 years. But we were told that it was just a friend. And, you know, Liberals said to me, well, you know, it's not fair for you to question a guy who's a billionaire, who pays the Prime Minister and some key politicians to come and hang out with him and pays their way while he's lobbying, because they're just friends. They said, well, don't you have friends that invite you to places? Yeah, certainly. I'm from Northern Ontario. I get invited to fish huts all the time during the winter, you know, and for the price of a 6-pack of Labatt's, you know, I might get paid back in a little pickerel. It's not the same with Liberals who hang with billionaires who lobby the same government for favors. Now, I want to talk about this idea of friendship in the Liberals because it is a fundamental question about ethics that they don't understand. Is that the reason we have the Lobbying Act, the reason we have the Conflict of Interest Act, is so that friends don't have insider access. That's right. There was always a problem. It goes back in the pork barrel days of the Liberals of who you knew in the PMO. You know, Buddy from the Liberal Party would be tied to the Prime Minister, and he would step out and go into private practice, and then he would call up his friend in the Prime Minister's office, and changes would be made. And we've realized that that's not ethical. What's ethical is that there has to be a standard for lobbying, for example, that we know who is lobbying and why they're lobbying. A little bit of transparency goes a long way. And so the issue of actually closing an ethical loophole matters, because what we do in Parliament is about reassuring Canadians that they can trust us. They don't have to pay attention to all the details of the votes. In fact, you know, there's not a single voter who would agree with every single thing we do as parliamentarians, because we're called upon to make decisions on all manner of issues. But what our voters should be able to trust is that we are acting in the best interests of the Canadian people, and that when we meet with large financial interests who are trying to influence government policy, it's being done in a transparent manner and for the benefit of Canadians. So this is why I want to get back to this notion of friends and Liberal friends. So we have the situation of the Prime Minister who flew to Billionaires Island and contravened numerous sections of the Conflict of Interest Act. And that's actually unprecedented, that a Prime Minister has been found guilty of breaching the Conflict of Interest Act, for accepting gifts, for accepting favors. And yet the Prime Minister didn't think anything was wrong because he said the guy he hadn't seen in 30 years was a personal family friend, that as though they were above the law. And it's very embarrassing. Now, I would chalk that up. You know, I don't think it was malice on the Prime Minister's part. My Conservative friends always think there was some kind of skullduggery. I don't. I think the Prime Minister just thought, hey, you know, you knew my dad, he's a billionaire. I like hanging out with billionaires. I got a free trip to an island. But the Prime Minister needs to understand he sets a better example, because the Prime Minister promised a better example. And he promised it in that 2015 election, when he talked about that it wouldn't just be the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. But my God, how they have fallen since then. And the other guest who hung out on the beach on Billionaires Island, who's now the Veterans Affairs Minister, didn't even bother to report the trip. And the Prime Minister didn't report the gifts he received from the Aga Khan because he said, well, since they were inappropriate gifts, I didn't need to say what they were. And you know, Madam Speaker, over these many years I've been here, I've heard all manner of hog swallow when it comes to defending abuse. But I've never heard someone use the loophole to say, since it was inappropriate, I wasn't obligated to say what it is, therefore I'm somehow protected. And I want to know if the member who's now the Veterans Affairs Minister used the same logic when he decided that, hey, just because he took a trip to Billionaires Island. He didn't need to report it. Well, we need to report everything we do to the Ethics Commission. It's up to the Ethics Commissioner to decide whether it's appropriate or not. It's not for the individual member to say, well, I accepted this free gift because, hey, it was a free gift and it doesn't affect my political work. Everything does. It's about accountability. You know, speaking of friends of the Liberal Party, let's talk about Stephen Brofman. Now, this man is one of the most powerful men in Canada, and he's certainly a powerful Liberal fundraiser. In fact, he's so powerful, he raised $250,000 for his personal friend, the Prime Minister, in 2 hours for the Liberal Party. That is an amazing power. Now, the Prime Minister would say, well, they're just friends, because the Prime Minister really certainly loves hanging out with billionaires. And the Prime Minister held a recent fundraiser with billionaires and the super rich in Montreal, and he told us all the reason they were there was to get tough on the 1%. Now, can you imagine that? Do you imagine that the reason that the billionaire class is paying money to the Liberal Party is so that they can get tough on the 1%? That's not how life works. But how it does work is when Stephen Brofman was named in the Paradise Papers scandal. A scandal that identified powerful people around the world who were evading their tax responsibilities through tax havens. And Stephen Brofman was one of the Canadians named. The Prime Minister immediately intervened and said that no investigation was necessary. And no investigation happened. That is the power of friends in the Prime Minister's office. But it is also highly inappropriate, because it is not up for the Prime Minister of this country to decide in advance whether or not tax laws in this country have been broken just because someone is A, his personal friend, and 2, raises money for the Liberal Party. That is not an ethical standard that you can trust. But it seems to work for this government. And this issue needs to be called out. Madam Speaker, we have the recent debacle in India, where the Prime Minister's trip seemed to be much more about trying to shore up domestic ridings to win than actually worrying about international diplomacy, international security, and international credibility. And so we certainly had the bizarre and unprecedented situation where a convicted terrorist got on the all-access pass list because he was very powerful in local BC Liberal politics. But we also have the member for Brampton who went on that trip. Now, the member for Brampton, who after he got elected, went into business. Now, that's, for folks back home, it is very, very rare that someone decides to get to go into business after becoming an MP. And when the few who do, there has to be really clear laws in place so that they're not using their desk in Parliament to help their friends. And yet the member for Brampton, we are told, invited his business partner to have access to the Prime Minister and to key Liberal ministers on that India trip. Now, does it pass the smell test? It certainly does not. And it raises a question about the lack of ethics and accountability that's in the Liberal caucus right now, that they seem to think this is perfectly okay. In fact, we've heard from every senior voice from the Liberal government on these ethical breaches that not once do they take these issues seriously. They seem to think it's okay because, hey, he's a good guy, the other guy is a good guy, they're all friends. And it's this culture of friends and using the position of power within politics to further those interests of friends. That is wrong. So the issue before us today is about closing loopholes. And, you know, I've spent many years on this file, Madam Speaker, and it always surprises me that even when you think you've done your best to make sure that people will follow the spirit of the law, there will be always those who try and find a way to slip around it. Exhibit A, I present the Finance Minister. Now, this Finance Minister, I've been told by the Liberals that I'm completely out of line because he's virtuous, because people who are that rich who offer themselves to public service have to be somehow more virtuous by nature because they don't need to come to Ottawa. Well, fair play. But the Finance Minister, when he was head of Morneau, Chappelle, his family business, announced to his investors that we needed legislation in Canada to be able to change the defined pension benefits, which would allow the targeted pension plans, which was the whole focus of Morneau Chappelle's business. And he said that there was an enormous opportunity and that his company, Morneau Chappelle, was in the driver's seat of this. And he offered himself as a candidate for public service. And the very first order of business he brought forward was the legislation, Bill C-27, that would directly benefit the company and the industry that he represented. That's extraordinary. Yeah. And the Prime Minister supported that. There was no recusing at Cabinet of a man who had a pecuniary financial interest, and later we found out, of course, he still had his financial interest. He was making about $150,000 a month from his Morneau Chappelle shares, while he was pursuing an interest that would benefit Morneau Chappelle. Now, he became famous because he was so rich he forgot that he owned a chateau in the south of France. And again, the Liberals said that we were being mean and that was really unfair. You know, a lot of people forget things. I mean, I forget things all the time. I was leaving the house the other day. I forgot my car keys. I couldn't find where they were. But I don't know anybody in the house who forgets that they own a chateau in the south of France. That's the level of disconnect of the 1% from the rest of us. And the reason this matters, Madam Speaker, is because the fundamental economic issue of our time around the world is the growing disparity between the super rich, whose interests have been advanced year after year after year, and the growing new working class that are both white collar and blue collar, who are finding it harder and harder because they're dealing with larger levels of student debt and precarious work. And we have a government that is deeply embedded within that 1%, and that they use their position to advance friends, to advance political agendas that help their friends, and they say that this is all perfectly okay because they're all nice people. That is not an ethical standard of accountability. So today, we have an opportunity to close an ethical loophole that was clearly identified. And I would think that when we identify these loopholes, it's incumbent upon all of us within the political realm to say, let's just do the right thing here. Let's make sure that this kind of abuse doesn't happen in the future and close that loophole. And I return, Madam Speaker, to what the Prime Minister promised in the 2015 election, and I was so impressed when he stepped forward and talked about openness and transparency and transparent government, principles that Canadians across the political spectrum agree with. And that one of the issues that we've always had with the problem with the Ethics Code and the Lobbying Act, I mean, certainly with the Ethics Code, it's always been that if you didn't find the person falling down dead with the other person with the gun in the hand and the smoke and the Ethics Commissioner walking in at the time, you could never prove it because you could never prove the intent. And the Lobbying Commissioner has pointed out time and time and time again that it is about the spirit of the act, because it is the power of people to influence politicians that has to be clearly defined. Because when you have super powerful people, they don't have to register for lobbying because they know the people in the PMO. They're the friends. They're the ones that hang out on the beach, on the private islands with key politicians. And they make a phone call and the job gets done. And this is why when the Prime Minister said that he would establish a higher standard, a standard that represented the spirit of the law and not just the narrow letter of the law, that I was deeply encouraged. But yet here we are with ethical scandal after ethical scandal after ethical scandal, and each time the Prime Minister or his front bench people step up and defend this because, hey, they didn't technically catch us on anything. They're our friends. They're nice people that we hang with. And there's no need to address these loopholes. And I just find that an appallingly low standard. And there's a new line that they use, and they used it on my colleague from Brampton and my colleague from Newfoundland who took the trip to Billionaires Island. They say they always work very closely with the Ethics Commissioner. What they need to put is the prefixes after we get caught. we work closely with the Ethics Commissioner. This is what the Prime Minister and his minions have told us, is the Prime Minister worked very closely with the Ethics Commissioner. The Prime Minister started to work with the Ethics Commissioner after the complaint was lodged, after he'd been found guilty of numerous breaches of accepting inappropriate travel and inappropriate gifts from someone who was in a position to lobby, and he did not recuse himself from decisions that could have benefited that powerful lobbyist. If the Prime Minister and his caucus stood by the principle of working closely with the Ethics Commissioner, they would phone the Ethics Commissioner prior to these issues, prior to inviting a business partner to meet with the Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers on the India trip and say, hey, my business partner wants me to open some doors for him. Is that okay? And the Ethics Commissioner would have responded. That's how you work closely with the Ethics Commissioner. You work with them in advance to make sure that you're not caught in illegalities or breaches of rules. You don't wait till you get caught. You don't wait till it's a newspaper story and then say you're going to make sure you don't do it again. That is a lower standard, and a standard that unfortunately this Prime Minister and his government seem to have worked their way to. So in conclusion, Madam Speaker, there are moments when we have to take a breath in Parliament and say breaches have happened. And when breaches have happened, we need to then come forward with a credible set of responses. And this is actually brings us back to the defeat of the Liberals in 2006, when there were so many ethical breaches, so many legal breaches in the sponsorship scandal that we needed to bring forward new legislation. And that legislation was about lobbying. That legislation was about limiting the influence of insiders on political decisions. That was about making sure that we had higher standards of accountability. Now, I can say in the previous government, they had many, many fails and failures and falls as well. We had the notorious Bev Oda. We used to spend thousands of dollars on limousine rides bombing around Toronto. And Bev thought it was perfectly okay. You know, we had Paul Calandra, who's, you know, lobbied while a parliamentary secretary over FM licenses, but I note, if I remember correctly, that money was returned because it was deemed inappropriate. So we've had a number of instances. We had Bruce Carson, you know, who left the PMO, who was invited into the PMO and had been convicted of fraud. He then left, and then he came back in and was trying to sell water plants to desperately poor Indigenous communities. In his case of inappropriate illegalities has gone all the way to the Supreme Court. So there will always be politicians who abuse the system. We know that. That is part and parcel of public life. But what we need to do is when we identify new ways that are of subverting the act, because we cannot assume that all politicians will be either A, moral enough to do this, or to sometimes be bright enough to actually pay attention to the act and understand the implications of using their office to help friends, that when a loophole appears that is an egregious loophole, it's incumbent upon all political parties to close the loophole. It's a fairly straightforward question, Madam Speaker. And so I want to just find that, you know, when I'm reading the interesting report, the report on the Prime Minister on the Conflict of Interest Act, that, you know, that the Ethics Commissioner found that Mr. Prime Minister contravened Section 11 of the Act when he and his family accepted the gifts of hospitality from the Aga Khan and the use of his private island in March and December 16. I found that the exception for gifts under 11(2) and B of the Act for gifts from relatives and friends did not apply, because the Prime Minister's relationship with the Aga Khan was based on a family connection rooted in a friendship that existed 30 years earlier with the Prime Minister's father. So we have the Prime Minister who accepted inappropriate gifts and said, no, they were personal family gifts when he hadn't met the guy in 30 years. And that said that, and this is really, really important, that Section 21 of the Act was deliberately contravened by the Prime Minister because he did not recuse himself from discussions that provided an opportunity to improperly further the private interests associated with one of the institutions of the Aga Khan, and that he contravened Section 5 for failing to arrange his private affairs as to avoid such an opportunity. That is a serious breach, because that is the question about giving gifts from powerful people to powerful politicians. It's the power to influence political decisions. And that's what the Conflict of Interest Commissioner was concerned with. And of course, there was a contravention of Section 12 of the Act, which being that I'm running out of time, I could go on all day with ethical breaches of this government, Madam Speaker, but I will close on that note. Thank you.
Question